There's a photograph that shouldn't exist. It was taken in 1972 by a man named Thomas Harold, an engineer from San Bernardino who disappeared 3 days after pressing the shutter. The photograph shows something massive beneath the surface of California's Salton Sea, something with geometry too perfect to be natural, and eyes that seem to track the camera even through 60 feet of murky water. Federal agents confiscated the camera. They questioned everyone who'd seen the image. They classified the incident under a designation that still hasn't been declassified. But here's what they couldn't erase: the memory of what Thomas Harold witnessed before he vanished, and the fact that he wasn't the first to see it. He was just the first to try documenting it. What happened to him is part of a pattern that stretches back over a century, a pattern of disappearances, impossibilities, and secrets that suggest California's greatest environmental disaster might actually be something far stranger and far more dangerous than anyone wants to admit. This is the story of the Salton Sea. But more importantly, it's the story of what lives beneath it. The fish started walking out of the water at Bombay Beach on a Tuesday morning in late September 1972. The date was the 26th, though you won't find it mentioned in any official records. Not crawling, not flopping desperately in the sand like fish do when they beach themselves. Walking. Martin Cordova was the first to see them. He'd come down to the shore at dawn to check his nets, same as he'd done every morning for 8 years. The sun was just breaking over the Chocolate Mountains to the east, painting the water that strange copper color it gets in early light. That's when he noticed the movement. Hundreds of tilapia were emerging from the shallows, moving upright on their tail fins like soldiers on parade. Their bodies were rigid, perpendicular to the ground, advancing in perfect formation across the salt-crusted beach. Martin said later that it looked choreographed, like someone had trained them, like they were following orders from something he couldn't see. He stood there frozen, watching this impossible procession. The fish made no sound except for the wet slap of their tails against the hardpack. They didn't flounder or struggle. They simply marched, their bodies impossibly balanced, their movements synchronized with mechanical precision. Martin followed them. He told his wife he didn't know why he did it. Some compulsion he couldn't name drew him along in their wake. The fish walked exactly 1 mile inland before. As if responding to a signal, they all collapsed simultaneously. Not gradually, not one by one, but in the same instant, as though whatever force had been animating them had simply switched off. The bodies formed a perfectly straight line. Martin paced it out. The line pointed directly toward the geographic center of the Salton Sea. That's when he noticed their eyes. Every single fish had eyes turned black as volcanic glass. Not the glassy deadness of fish eyes, but a deep, lightless black that seemed to absorb the sunlight. And when Martin knelt down to examine one of the bodies, he found something lodged in its gills, sand that glittered with tiny metallic flecks. He'd lived in the desert his entire life. He knew every type of sand in the Imperial Valley. This didn't match anything. It was dark, almost black, and unusually heavy. When he took a sample to a geology professor at San Diego State a week later, the professor went pale and told him it was volcanic sand, the kind found at the bottom of deep ocean trenches, in places that haven't seen sunlight for millions of years, places where the pressure would crush a human being into paste. How did deep-sea sand get into the gills of freshwater fish in a landlocked California lake? Martin Cordova died in 1998, but his daughter still has the sample. She's refused multiple offers from private collectors who somehow know about it. She keeps it in a safe deposit box and says that sometimes, late at night, she swears she can hear it humming. Marine biologists from UC Riverside arrived within 48 hours of Martin's report. They found the fish bodies exactly as he'd described them, arranged with mathematical precision, each corpse exactly 18 inches from the next. The measurements were so exact that they used surveying equipment to verify them, 18 inches down to the millimeter, for over 600 fish across a mile of desert. The lead biologist, Dr. Catherine Hollis, took tissue samples and photographs. She documented the strange sand in the gills, the blackened eyes, the absence of any signs of disease or poisoning. Her preliminary report noted that the fish appeared to have been dead for several weeks, based on tissue decomposition, despite witnesses seeing them walking just hours earlier. That report never made it past the draft stage. On October 3, 1972, federal agents arrived in 3 black SUVs. They wore suits despite the 100-degree heat and identified themselves only as being from a federal environmental protection agency that no one had heard of. They confiscated all physical evidence, the fish bodies, the sand samples, the photographs, Dr. Hollis's notes. They interviewed everyone who'd witnessed the event, taking detailed statements that were never filed with local law enforcement. And they took Thomas Harold. Thomas wasn't a biologist or a government official. He was a 34-year-old civil engineer who worked for Imperial County, designing irrigation systems. He'd been at Bombay Beach that morning by pure chance. His wife had asked him to take photographs of the sunrise for her photography class. He'd captured the fish on film. According to his wife, Elena, 2 men in suits came to their home on October 3rd. They were polite but firm. They needed Thomas to come with them to answer some questions about what he'd photographed. He'd be back by dinner. He never came home. Elena filed a missing persons report on October 5th. The Imperial County Sheriff's Department launched an investigation, but they hit walls at every turn. The federal agents had left no contact information. The agency they'd claimed to represent didn't exist in any government directory. The SUVs had no license plates that anyone could remember. Thomas Harold had simply vanished, as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Except for his camera. The camera appeared 3 days after Thomas's disappearance, floating in the middle of the Salton Sea, approximately 12 miles from shore. A fishing boat spotted it bobbing in the water, perfectly buoyant despite being a heavy Nikon F2 that should have sunk immediately. The fisherman who retrieved it said the camera was ice cold to the touch, even though it had been floating under the desert sun for hours. When they opened the back, they found the film still inside, undamaged by the water. The camera itself showed no signs of water intrusion. The seals were intact, the interior completely dry. The film was another story. When it was developed by a news photographer named David Chen, who Eleanor Harold had hired privately, only 1 image was recoverable. The rest of the roll had been exposed to heat so intense it had melted portions of the film strip. Yet somehow the camera's plastic body showed no heat damage, no warping, no melting, no discoloration. That single surviving photograph is burned into the memory of everyone who's seen it. It shows the Salton Sea from an elevated angle, probably taken from one of the small hills near Bombay Beach. The water is clear enough in the foreground that you can see the rocky bottom. But in the center of the frame, in the deeper water, there's something massive. David Chen described it as looking like a submarine at first glance. But the proportions were all wrong. Too long, too smooth, and there were structures on its surface, protrusions or appendages arranged in ways that made his eyes hurt when he tried to focus on them. But the most disturbing element was in the upper left corner of the frame. Just beneath the surface, there was what appeared to be an eye. Not a fish eye, not any kind of eye that belongs to a creature from Earth. It was enormous, easily 15 feet in diameter, and it was staring directly at the camera with an intelligence that Chen said made him feel physically ill. It wasn't looking at the camera, he told Elena Harold when he gave her the print. It was looking at Thomas. It knew he was there, and I think I was pleased. Elena took the photograph to the sheriff's department, to the FBI, to every news outlet in Southern California. No one would touch it. The sheriff's department said it was clearly a hoax. The FBI said they didn't investigate paranormal phenomena. News outlets said they couldn't publish something so obviously fabricated. Within a week, Elena's house was broken into. Nothing was taken except the photograph and all the negatives. The break-in was professional. No forced entry, no fingerprints. Her neighbors saw nothing. Even the copy she'd hidden in her sister's house in Los Angeles disappeared the same night. David Chen had kept one print for himself, hidden in his darkroom. He looked at it once more the night after the break-ins, then burned it. He told a friend that he couldn't sleep with that image in his house, couldn't stand knowing that something was looking back at him from the paper. Elena Harold spent the next 3 years searching for her husband. She hired private investigators, filed Freedom of Information requests, contacted everyone from local congressmen to the Pentagon. She got nowhere. Thomas Harold had been erased from the official record as thoroughly as his photograph. She moved to Oregon in 1976 and never spoke about the Salton Sea again. But the disappearances didn't stop with Thomas Harold. They'd been happening long before he vanished, and they continued long after. He was just one name in a pattern that stretches back to the day the Salton Sea was born. And to understand that pattern, you have to understand that the Salton Sea itself is wrong. Its existence is an accident, a mistake of such magnitude that it altered the geology of the entire region. But some people think it wasn't an accident at all. The Salton Sea sits in California's Colorado desert like an open wound in the earth, 343 square miles of water that shouldn't exist, lying 236 feet below sea level in a geological depression called the Salton Sink. This isn't a natural lake formed by rivers or rainfall over millennia. This is a scar that was carved by the planet's violence and filled by human stupidity. And if you believe the old stories, it's a doorway that was never supposed to open. The Salton Sink is ancient. Geological surveys show that this basin has filled and drained dozens of times over the last 3 million years, each time leaving behind layers of sediment that tell stories of different eras. There are fossil beds here containing the remains of extinct species, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, creatures that died when the lake dried up 10,000 years ago. But there are other things in those fossil layers, things that don't match any known species in the paleontological record. In 1957, a University of California paleontology team excavating near the ancient shoreline found skeletal remains that they couldn't classify. The bones were large, suggesting a creature between 20 and 30 feet long. But the structure was unlike anything they'd encountered. The joints articulated in ways that seemed biomechanically impossible. The skull had eye sockets positioned in ways that suggested the creature could see in nearly 360 degrees. The team spent 3 months studying the find before their funding was abruptly cut. The fossils were transferred to federal custody for further analysis and never returned. The lead paleontologist, Dr. Raymond Marsh, fought the transfer but was overruled by the university administration. He retired 2 years later and spent his remaining years writing letters to colleagues, warning them not to excavate in the Salton Basin. In one letter, discovered after his death in 1983, he wrote, "What we found wasn't extinct, it was dormant, and I fear we've awakened it." The indigenous peoples who lived in this region for thousands of years had many names for the Salton sink, but they all understood it as a place of power and danger. The Cahuilla people called it the Hollow of the Hand of God, a sacred space where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. Their oral traditions speak of cyclical floods that would fill the basin every few centuries, transforming the desert into a temporary sea. During the dry periods, they would perform ceremonies at specific locations around the sink, ceremonies designed to keep certain things sealed beneath the earth. These weren't metaphorical rituals. They were pragmatic magical work, performed with the same seriousness that one might maintain a dam or repair a levee. The Cahuilla understood that there were forces in the Salton sink, ancient, patient things that had existed long before humans walked the desert, and these forces needed to be contained. When anthropologist Dr. Margaret Sanders interviewed Cahuilla elders in 1923, she asked about these ceremonies. The elders were reluctant to discuss them, saying that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. But one elder, whose name wasn't recorded at his request, told her something that she only published decades later in her private journals. The sink is a doorway. When it's dry, the door is sealed. When it fills with water, the door opens. But there are rituals that can keep the door locked even when the water comes. For 10,000 years, we kept it locked. Then the white men came with their machines and their canals, and they filled the sink with poisoned water from a stolen river. The water broke the seals we'd maintained for 100 generations. Now the door is open, and we don't have the power to close it anymore. All we can do is watch and wait for what comes through. Dr. Sanders dismissed this as superstition in her public writings, but in her private journals she noted something troubling. Every single Cahuilla family she interviewed had left the Salton Basin by 1930. They'd abandoned traditional lands their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years. When she asked why, they would only say that it was no longer safe, that the old protections had failed. The Kumeyaay people, who lived in the southern portions of the basin, had similar traditions. They spoke of a great water that came and went, and of things that lived in the depths during the wet centuries. Things that would burrow deep into the earth when the waters receded, waiting for the next flood. With the patience of geological time, Spanish explorers who entered the region in the 1700s recorded strange phenomena that they attributed to desert demons or purgatorial manifestations. Juan Bautista de Anza, exploring the area in 1574, wrote in his journal about lights that danced above the desert floor at night. Not campfires or reflections, but luminous spheres that moved with apparent purpose and intelligence. His indigenous guides refused to approach these lights. They told de Anza that this was a cursed valley where time moved differently, where men could walk into the heat shimmer and emerge decades later, or not at all. Father Francisco Garces, traveling through in 1776, documented an incident that haunted him for the rest of his life. His expedition encountered the body of a Spanish soldier from a party that had passed through the area just 1 week earlier. The soldier's companions swore they'd seen him alive and healthy 6 days prior. But the body Garces found was ancient. The flesh was completely mummified by salt. The leather of his boots had cracked with age. Most disturbingly, his armor, which should have been relatively new, was corroded as if it had been exposed to centuries of weathering. The metal had degraded in ways that typically took hundreds of years. Garcés performed last rites over the body and ordered it buried quickly. In his journal, he wrote, "This land is touched by something beyond my understanding. Time itself seems wounded here." For 300 years after that, the Salton sink remained mostly dry, a vast salt flat that shimmered in the desert heat, occasionally filling with shallow, temporary pools after rare storms. The indigenous peoples maintained their careful distance, and the few white settlers who tried to farm the edges of the basin reported strange maladies and disturbing dreams that drove them away. Then came 1901, and everything changed. The California Development Company had a vision: transform the Colorado Desert into a new Garden of Eden. They would divert water from the Colorado River through a series of canals, irrigation that would turn barren wasteland into prime agricultural land. It was ambitious, expensive, and as events would prove, catastrophically reckless. The company's chief engineer was Charles Rockwood, a man whose confidence exceeded his caution. When he proposed cutting a canal from the Colorado River to the Imperial Valley, he did so with minimal surveys and even less concern for the geological instability of the region. Local workers, many of them indigenous or Mexican laborers who knew the old stories, warned Rockwood about the unstable soils. They told him about ancient watercourses that ran beneath the surface like veins in the earth. They spoke of places where the ground would suddenly liquefy without warning, swallowing equipment and animals whole. They said the desert didn't want to be flooded, that there were reasons the basin had been allowed to remain dry. Rockwood dismissed these warnings as superstitious nonsense. He proceeded with construction. The canal opened in 1901, and for 4 years it functioned adequately, delivering water to Imperial Valley farms. But the company had made a fatal error. They'd cut their canal without proper gates, without flood controls, without any real understanding of the Colorado River's seasonal fury. In 1905, heavy winter rains combined with massive spring snowmelt in the Rocky Mountains. The Colorado River swelled beyond anyone's predictions, and the hastily constructed canal gave way like tissue paper. For 18 months, the entire Colorado River, one of the continent's major waterways, poured into the Salton sink. The catastrophe unfolded with the slow inevitability of a nightmare. The Imperial Valley Development Company tried desperately to stem the flow, dumping rock and earth into the breach. But the current swept their efforts away like children's toys. The sink began to fill at an astonishing rate, hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water per day rushing into a basin that had been dry for 4 centuries. But it wasn't just water that poured into the growing sea. Entire settlements along the Colorado River were swept away by the diverted current. Houses, churches, stores, all of it tumbled into the churning water and was carried into the sink. Most disturbingly, graveyards were unearthed, spilling their contents into the flood. Workers trying to control the breach reported finding strange objects in the water, things that couldn't have come from the local farms or settlements. Ancient stone tablets with hieroglyphs that matched no known language. Not Egyptian, not Mayan, not Aztec. Nothing in any linguistic database. Metal instruments of unknown purpose with designs that suggested a sophisticated technology, but from no identifiable culture. One work crew fished out a sealed copper box that had been burnished to a golden sheen by its time in the water. When they forced it open, they found it filled with water that glowed with a faint, sickly green light. The glow lasted for exactly 3 days before fading, and the men who'd opened the box reported severe nightmares during that period. Dreams of cities built in impossible configurations, of skies with too many moons, of oceans that defied gravity. The box and its contents were turned over to the California Development Company's headquarters. There's no record of what happened to it after that. The Southern Pacific Railroad eventually took over efforts to stop the flood, throwing their considerable resources at the problem. They spent over $3 million, an astronomical sum in 1906, dumping entire trainloads of rock, earth, and debris into the breach. They diverted hundreds of workers from other projects. They operated around the clock, desperately trying to stop the flow before the growing sea destroyed the railroad's infrastructure. And all the while, workers reported seeing things in the churning water. William Morrison was a freight engineer supervising rock deliveries to the breach site. On the evening of August 14, 1906, he was standing on the shore, directing the unloading of a freight car, when something surfaced in the water about 50 yards out. Morrison would later swear in a notarized statement that he saw eyes, enormous eyes the size of dinner plates, break the surface and stare directly at him. Not at the work site in general, not at the commotion and lights, but specifically at him. The eyes were intelligent, filled with what Morrison described as ancient knowing. They held his gaze for perhaps 10 seconds, and in that time Morrison felt the thing seeing him. Not just his physical presence, but something deeper. His name, his fears, his dreams. Then the eyes submerged, and Morrison ran. He didn't stop until he reached the rail camp 3 miles away. He quit the Southern Pacific Railroad the next morning, moved his family to Oregon, and never set foot in Southern California again. Before he left, he told his brother something that the family kept private for decades. "It knew me. I don't know how to explain it, but that thing in the water looked at me and it knew my name. It knew things about me I've never told anyone. And the worst part, I think it was a pleasure to see me there, pleased that we were filling its home with water." Railroad records discovered in a Southern Pacific archive in 2003 mention other incidents from that period. Incidents that were never reported to the press or investigated by authorities. 3 workers disappeared on the night of September 12, 1906, experienced men who knew the dangers of working near water. An extensive search found no bodies, no signs of struggle, no clues to their fate. What they did find were the men's clothes, neatly folded on the bank. Their boots were placed side by side, facing the water. Inside each boot was a small pile of salt, shaped into a perfect pyramid. The company listed the men as deserters to avoid paying death benefits to their families. On February 10, 1907, the Southern Pacific Railroad finally succeeded in closing the breach. The Colorado River returned to its natural course, flowing south toward the Gulf of California. The damage was done. The Salton Sink had been transformed into the Salton Sea, California's largest lake, covering nearly 1,000 square miles at its peak. The water had drowned entire communities. The town of Salton, which had thrived as a salt mining operation, vanished completely beneath the waves. Parts of the Torres Martinez Desert Cahuilla Indian Reservation disappeared. Ancient archaeological sites, some never properly surveyed, were lost forever. The indigenous people who were displaced spoke of angry spirits awakened by the flood. They said a balance had been disturbed that could never be restored, that the seals their ancestors had maintained for generations were broken beyond repair. State officials dismissed these concerns as superstition, but they couldn't explain certain phenomena. They couldn't explain the lights that people reported seeing beneath the water in those first years. Not reflections or bioluminescence, but structured illumination that seemed to trace geometric patterns in the depths. They couldn't explain the sounds that echoed across the water on windless nights, not the natural creaking of settling sediment or the calls of waterfowl, but something that sounded disturbingly like voices speaking in unison, chanting in rhythms that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. The first scientific expedition to study the new sea was led by Professor Harrison Wells from Stanford University in 1908. Wells was a respected geologist who approached the project with academic rigor and skepticism. His published papers from the expedition are models of scientific observation, noting water chemistry, geological formations, and sediment patterns. But his private journal tells a very different story. The journal was kept locked away by the Wells family for 90 years, only coming to light when his granddaughter donated his papers to Stanford's archives in 1998. In it, Wells documented phenomena that he deliberately excluded from his official reports. He wrote about equipment malfunctions that only occurred at specific locations around the sea. Compasses would spin wildly, sometimes pointing downward toward the Earth instead of north. Theodolites used for surveying would show measurements that changed when measured from the same position. Water samples collected in sealed containers would change color overnight, from clear to murky green, or sometimes to a dark red that looked disturbingly like blood, despite being stored in locked boxes with no access to light or air. On their final night at the sea, Wells and 2 graduate assistants set up camp on the North Shore. At approximately 3 a.m., Wells was awakened by one of his students who insisted he come look at the water. From their elevated position, they could see into the depths, and there, illuminated by moonlight, were structures. Wells described them as geometric forms, too regular to be natural. Perfect right angles, parallel lines, shapes that suggested intentional construction. They appeared to be built from stone or some other solid material, not deposited sediment. The structures formed patterns that Wells, who had studied ancient architecture extensively, couldn't place in any cultural tradition he knew. They attempted to photograph the structures using both standard photography and the new technology of flash photography. They exposed an entire box of film plates, trying to capture what they were seeing. When they developed the plates back at Stanford, every single image was completely black, not underexposed, but entirely void of any visual information. The plates looked as if they'd been exposed to light, yet other images from the same cameras and the same batch of film, taken just hours earlier, had turned out perfectly normal. Wells wrote in his journal, "I cannot explain what we witnessed. I cannot explain the photographic failure. In my 20 years as a scientist, I have never encountered phenomena that so completely defy rational analysis. There is something beneath the Salton Sea that predates human presence in this region. I am certain of this, though I have no evidence I can present to my peers. I only know that looking at those structures, I felt the uncanny certainty that they were watching us in return." Wells never returned to the Salton Sea. He continued his academic career, but colleagues noted a change in him after the expedition, a hesitancy to make definitive statements, a haunted quality to his demeanor when asked about his time there. He died in 1931. Among his final papers was a sealed letter addressed to whoever comes after me to study the sea. His granddaughter opened it in 1998. It contained only one sentence: "Leave it alone. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed.